computer is picking up a strange signal. Here, sir, you better take a look at it.
Hi, and welcome to Sci-Fi Snacks. I'm Liz J. Bradley, a science fiction author and poet who adores short fiction and snacks. Each episode of Sci-Fi Snacks is a short and sweet, or salty, discussion of what I loved, what I learned, and what I snacked on while reading new-to-me short science fiction. As always, links to the short stories are in the show notes, so if you haven't read this week's story, head on over, pick up your favorite snack, and then join me as we discuss this week's story. Hello all, and welcome back to this next episode of Sci-Fi Snacks. I'm so excited to talk to you this week about the story Tantie Merle and the Farmhand 4200. This was written by R.S.A. Garcia for Uncanny magazine and comes in at 6,861 words. But let me tell you, those words fly by. I had such a great time reading this story. R.S.A. Garcia is a writer of speculative fiction and a Sturgeon, Nebula, Locus, and Ignyte Award finalist. Her Amazon best-selling science fiction, Lex Talionis, received a starred review from Publishers Weekly and the silver medal for Best Sci-Fi Fantasy Horror ebook from the Independent Publishers Awards in 2015. She has published short fiction in venues such as Clark's World Magazine, Escape Pod, Strange Horizons, and International Magazine. Her stories have been longlisted for the British Science Fiction Awards, translated into several languages, and included in a number of anthologies, including the critically acclaimed The Best of World SF, the Best Science Fiction of the Year, and the Apex Book of World SF. She lives in Trinidad and Tobago with an extended family and too many cats. Learn more at rsagarcia.com. I wanted to celebrate this episode because we crossed a really exciting milestone with the Sci-Fi Snacks podcast. This past week, we crossed 1,000 downloads, which isn't a lot for a lot of like really big shows. But for this little podcast that I started, recording at the public library, it was a big deal to me. I thought, wow, 1,000 times someone has decided to click play on this little show, and that was really exciting. So this week, in honor of that, I decided to change my snack from what was going to be, I had written down in my spreadsheet that I was going to eat salad with this, I think because I was like, oh, it's on a farmhand robot, I'll just like read this and eat a salad for lunch. And I was like, that's kind of not the vibe I want anymore. So I picked cake. And to make it fit the story, I was like, okay, I'll have carrot cake. So if you go over on my social media at Liz J. Bradley over on Blue Sky or Instagram, you can see my fun little cake. And I got the candles that said 1,000, and my kids insisted on singing like a weird version of Happy Birthday to the podcast, even though it wasn't really the podcast's birthday, but it was fun regardless. So you can see those pictures over on social media, and just know that it was a delightful cake and a delightful time. And thank you for tuning in and listening week after week, checking out the back catalog, and just having a good time reading science fiction and snacking with me. Now, this story was up for a bunch of awards back in 2024. The Nebula Awards, this was the short story winner. It was a finalist for the Eugie Awards. It was nominated for the Ignyte Awards, and it won the Theodore Sturgeon Memorial Award. Now, one of the things that I think about a lot is, how do you write a winning story, an award-winning story? When I enter short story contests, a lot of the time people talk about emotional resonance, and it's something that I strive for. And generally, the general consensus is like, if you can make someone cry, you've probably got their vote. Like, it's a really good thing. So you tend to see like an overabundance of sad stories or stories that are trying to like purposefully pull at your heartstrings. And I do it myself sometimes. Now, I tend to write kind of sadder stuff in general, but let me tell you how refreshing it was to read this story and just have it embody so much joy. Like, it started in a place that was kind of sad. So you start the story and you meet Tantie Merle, and she is an older woman and she's all alone. Her children have all grown up. They have left town. They're all very successful. It was really, she's not upset about it. She's sad that her children have moved on, but it's not like an estrangement or anything. And her husband has passed away, her husband Lincoln, and she's all alone except for her little farm. And occasionally a little boy comes by and he cleans part of the house, and she sees some of the neighbors. And then there's this goat. And the goat's name is Ignatius. And first of all, what a great name for a goat. Like, I immediately thought of like Saint Ignatius, and it's probably just like the Catholicism in me. And I was just, I love like an overly formal name for what we come to find out is clearly a misbehaving goat. And I love that. And she talks, he's not really a problem. He's just a goat, but he's a goat that likes to eat everything. And so she has to take the goat to a field every day, and she's getting really old for it. And it's difficult for her. So kind of the inciting incident of the story here is that one of her daughters sends her a package one day. And when she opens it, it's this robot. And this robot is called the Farmhand 4200, like the story title. And we find out that it's this really smart robot. It connects to the internet and it downloads all these things. And Tantie Merle doesn't really know what to do with it at first, but she's open to the idea of this farmhand robot helping her out. It seems nice enough. So she goes about her day, the first day, kind of just showing the farmhand everything that she does around the farm. And so it gets an idea of how it can help. And then there's this really sweet moment where she's like, well, what do I call you? And the robot's like, well, you can call me whatever. But she decides to call him Lincoln, which is her dead husband's name, because she's like, well, he doesn't need it anymore. And I just got used to saying it. So can I call you Lincoln? And the farmhand robot is like, yes. And then we find out that there's like tens of thousands of these farmhand robots. And he is the first one to ever get a human name. And she's like, well, what are the rest of them named? And it's something like 39,999 are all named Farmhand 4200. And she's like, well, what about the other one? And it's like, well, there's one named Handy, but like Handy's not a human name. And I laughed. It was so funny. And I feel like this story was just full of these moments where you're having this robot interact with this old woman who is clearly not tech savvy. She does just enough. Reminds me of a lot of people who are able to do just enough with technology, but she approaches him in a way that is open to the humanity of the robot. And the robot is refreshed by this and surprised. And she's just like, well, you just be polite. Like, that's how, as a human, I should act. And I really, really kind of loved that. And this setup where it wasn't an antagonistic relationship between the robot and the human. And we saw how they both helped each other. This robot is out there doing the gardening and whatnot, but then Tantie Merle is teaching the robot how to crochet and how to knit and saying, come on in the house and hang out with me and be my companion. And as the farmhand is trying to solve problems, Lincoln is talking to all of these other farmhand robots And he's realizing what a unique situation this is. And that kind of undergirds the rest of the story. And where we come to a problem is that Lincoln's whole purpose is to help take care of Ignatius, the misbehaving goat, and take him out to the pasture and bring him back each day. And what happens is, unfortunately, Ignatius the goat decides that Lincoln would be something really fun to eat. So at the end of the first day, Lincoln doesn't come back, and Tantie Merle gets really worried and upset. And then the goat comes back and poops out the robot and like the nanobot parts of the robot. And Lincoln is able to, thankfully, reassemble himself. But it's sketchy and it's difficult for him to kind of reset. And so we go into this cycle of Lincoln having to put himself back together, trying something new, getting new advice from other farmhands, and trying something else to avoid being eaten. Unfortunately, getting eaten every day. And Tantie Merle is getting upset by this because even though Lincoln can regenerate and come back and different things like that, she's just, she's rightly upset that it's causing problems. And then she gets worried that, she's not going to be able to afford to fix him. And Lincoln is just like, oh, no, it's no problem. You're within the warranty period. So I ordered a bunch of stuff and it's all free because this is my primary task. And I got hurt in pursuit of my primary task. So it's all covered. And so we just kind of keep going in this cycle again and again and again. And we see how close they get and how much Lincoln is learning and kind of coming into his own. But then he starts getting really anxious and getting really worried because he thinks that, because he can't fulfill this task of taking care of this goat without getting eaten, and this is his primary task, he starts to become worried that Tantie Merle is going to return him. And if he gets returned, he knows that he'll be recycled, and essentially that recycling is death. And he's grown so much, and he's got a human name, and he's got this relationship, and he's learned all of these things, but he still can't do the one thing that he's supposed to do, and it's really stressing him out. And Tantie Merle ends up being like, it's fine. Like, your main purpose is to help me, and you have helped me in so many ways. Like, look around, look at my garden. I've got so many extra vegetables that people come by and I get to talk to them and share the wealth there. You're here and you showed me how to use my TV that I didn't know that I could watch all of these old shows that, my husband Lincoln didn't like to watch. You showed me the knitting channel or the crochet channel. I can't remember which. And you give me a foot massage and you help me. And I was lonely and you were there for me. And that is what's important. You showed me how to play the videos of my grandchildren that I had no idea how to play so that I feel less alone. Like, I'm not going to return you. I'm not going to get rid of you. And something in this conversation, I love when literature does this, where they're talking about one thing and then there's the solution to the other thing hidden in that conversation. And so hidden in that conversation is a realization for Lincoln that Ignatius's problem is that Ignatius the goat is lonely too. And so he's just trying to play and do these things. And so Lincoln is like, I've got it. I've solved it. And we come to find out the next day, Lincoln's solution is to turn into a goat version of himself. He morphs into this little goat robot and plays with Ignatius. And all of a sudden, Ignatius doesn't try to eat him anymore. Ignatius realizes, oh, this is a friend and I can have a good time. And they frolic like little goat friends together. And, Lincoln holds his goat leash in his mouth and leads him back and forth each day, and he doesn't get eaten, and it's all this happy ending, and it's so fun and just sweet and heartwarming. And I was like, I love this story. And there was so much that I loved about this story, but I've tried to really distill it down into a couple of bullet points because, you know, when you're a writer and it's like somebody reads your thing and they're like, oh my God, I loved it. And that's all you get. Like, that's not helpful. And it's also not helpful to me when I read something and I want to get better. Like, why did I love this so much? And I think the number one thing, my first bullet point, was the relationship between Tantie and the Lincoln robot, the Farmhand. I think that it was just written so well and so real in a way that we so often see the default is an antagonistic relationship or this kind of like master-servant relationship when it comes to robots, especially in stories. And this was a refreshingly different take. You know, we have this old lady who needs help, isn't really like up on the technology. She's very alone. And so she enters this with such an open heart and treats the robot nicely. I think that especially now, like where everybody is so in a lot of circles, there's a lot of antagonism towards technology right now with AI and how it's built just completely on stolen work. Like rightly so, there are not positive feelings about ChatGPT. Just this week, Grammarly decided to try and do this thing where they've since rolled it back because the backlash was insane, where they took their large language model and decided to slap both living and dead authors and experts' names on it and be like, you know, what would Stephen King say about your work? You can find out with Grammarly. And people are like, excuse me? They were never asked. There was never any sort of vetting. It was just, here, have robot Stephen King give his opinion on your work, and we're going to use his name and use ostensibly what he would say, like on a thing that was built from stolen work. Like, we stole Stephen King's books and took his brain and now we're using his image. Like, obviously that's not a good PR move and it's not going to make people feel good about your product. Now they have since rolled it back and like, good. But only after like a deluge of authors and editors and people who found their names on there emailing them being like, take me off of this thing. You don't have my permission. So in contrast, this story was a completely different vibe. And I think that part of it is there's a difference between a large language model built on stolen work that tries to replace creatives and a farmhand robot who's there to help someone who cannot physically do things anymore and is there to provide companionship and solve real problems. Like, I'm sorry, Copilot, it's not a real problem that I can't write an email. I can write an email. I don't need your robot to help me write my emails. Now, if I had a robot that could help me plow through the hard clay of my backyard and help make gardening a little bit easier, yes, sign me up. And I think that that's just it with this story. And this story was written several years back. So I feel like everything is like a pre and post ChatGPT world now where you're looking at science fiction and you're like, okay, is your AI pre ChatGPT? Because the sentiment is so different, I think, because science fiction writers and people have had this really optimistic view of technology. And a lot of the time it's aspirational, like this story. And I feel like I have a hard time interacting with AI stories because we're living through kind of the baby stages of, quote, AI. It's not really AI. You can listen to the back catalog for my ranting about how none of what we have is actually like artificial intelligence, but that's for a different episode. And this one, it's a practical robot. And this is what we want from our robots. And I think that that's why I just really liked it. And my last bullet point in what I loved about this story was just the ending was so satisfying. Because what happens, I didn't tell you already, is that essentially Lincoln himself finds all of this kind of fulfillment in his relationships with Ignatius, with Tantie Merle, with all of this. And this whole time he's been sharing information with these other farmhands. And these other farmhand robots are like, hey, I'm not getting this fulfillment. Like, where's my name? Where's my companionship? All of these things. Like, why do you get that and we don't? And essentially it causes this robot strike uprising against like the capitalist farms that are trying to use these robots to replace everything. And now there's a bunch of goat-shaped robots frolicking around, refusing to do their work because they've realized that life is something more. And Tantie Merle at the end is just like, I don't know how I'm responsible for this robot uprising and this emergence of sentience and all of this kind of stuff. But I just thought it was so sweet. And it did such a good job on a craft level of telling us what happened and the big world consequences through the point of view of our main character, who is not a tech person, who is not whatever. She literally like blows it off. She's like, I don't know what I have to do with it. I was just hanging out with my robot friend and teaching him how to crochet and knit and just being a good human. If that caused a robot uprising, oh, well, I guess. And I just thought it was so brilliantly done because we never broke that point of view. And we still got to see the waves of consequences. It's like the butterfly effect of like, be a good person, treat everyone and everything as you would like to be treated, and you'll change the world. This is a good transition into kind of what I learned or what I want to take from this story is the way that Garcia was able to world build, filtered through this one woman's point of view, was brilliant. We didn't need the whole history of the world. We didn't need the whole history of where we're at on Earth. We saw all of that through her life. Her love for her family, naming the farmhand Lincoln. That is such a world building moment and a character building moment. And like, you're taught in short stories how everything needs to pull its weight and like do multiple things. Naming the farmhand Lincoln, I felt like did like 3 things. The fact that her kids and other people in the village have all moved away, but she still loves them and they still love her. That says things about the world. We're in a world where children can't stay at home. People can't stay in their rural village. They need to go out. You know, her kids are successful. Her kids are trying to connect with her. And we see it all through her point of view. And that says a lot about this type of world, a type of world that is replacing a lot of rural jobs with robots. I just thought that it was brilliantly done on the page that we could get such a clear view of what type of world this was just by how it affected this one woman in her life without hitting us over the head with telling us anything. This is a great example of that show don't tell, where show don't tell is such hard advice for a lot of writers because they think it just means write the emotion instead of, you know, being like, he was mad. It's like he clenched his fists and sweat went down his brow or like whatever. Like that's a terrible example, but like that's what they think show don't tell means. But this story showed us a world without any sort of extensive lore dropping info dump of this is where we're at in the world and you need to know before we start the story. Like, no, we didn't. We learned it throughout. It was just beautifully woven in. Another thing that I am taking away from this story is it's written in a dialect and it is so well done. And you can tell that Garcia knows people and women who speak like this because it's not just, I think there are a lot of people who will try to write in a dialect that is not a part of their culture or not a part of their own way of speaking. And they do things like they just change spellings. But this dialect felt so real and lived in because it's more than just the spelling. It's the syntax. It's the rhythm of it. You know, this is not something I will ever do or create because it's so far outside of my own voice and my own life experience. But I think that it's something to learn from, to see how something like syntax and rhythm and all of those things build voice and build character in a way that's kind of like an extra layer on all of the other things that we have. So thinking about just like word choice of characters is something I know I'm doing in the book that I'm writing right now. I have certain characters that I'm like, okay, they would speak differently. Not necessarily a dialect, but the words that they choose, the rhythms of their sentences are going to be different based on their lives. And I think that this is just not an extreme example, but it is like there are a lot of people who say, you know, you can't write in a dialect, like you can't extend that through an entire story because it's exhausting to your reader. And I would disagree. And this story is a perfect example of that, because when it's done well, it becomes the rhythm of the story. It becomes the essence of this character on a page. And Uncanny magazine did an interview with R.S.A. Garcia, and she talked about how Tantie Merle just kind of came to her fully formed, and she could just hear this woman's voice from the get-go. And I think that's so clear. When I read that part of the interview, I was like, yes, I get that. And I thought that that was just brilliant. And the last thing that I learned here is, I think something that I mentioned earlier, how I tend to write really sad stories. And I think that that comes from a place of when I'm imagining these kind of dystopian futures and things, I always go, well, that's really depressing. And so I use the characters to reflect that. Now, this story did the opposite. I think that the point of view was so clear that we went from this kind of sad loneliness into this beautiful future in what is possibly a more dystopian type future. But because the individual world of Tantie Merle became such a joyous place, even after her loss, even after her isolation, even after all of these things, because she found connection with Lincoln, it could be a joyful story, even in a setting that wasn't necessarily always joyful. And I thought that that was a really interesting way to set up a story and way to structure a story. And I would love to play with this kind of idea of juxtaposition and how we can have a joyful life in a world that isn't always joyful. And I think maybe that's even more important right now, where if we let the whole weight of the world, maybe this is like a beyond writing lesson, where the world is really heavy right now. I may not see it in my little bubble, my little part of the world, but the whole world is not like that. But if you let that take over everything, it can be so overwhelming. And I think that this story shows that our individual lives, while connected to the world, are also separate from it in certain ways. And we can still have joy. We can still have connection. And so lastly, how do we bring this all back around to carrot cake? Because of course it has to have something to do with our snack, right? So my connection here is twofold. First, joy. This story was so joyful, and carrot cake is joyful inherently because it's amazing. My kids were a little worried when they heard that there were like vegetables in the cake, and I was like, don't even worry. It's so good. And they took a bite and they were like, this is amazing. And I was like, I told you. So there's just so much joy in carrot cake. And then as I kept thinking about it, because this is how my brain works, and I'm like, it has to be really well connected. And I thought about how I felt guilty for buying the cake at the store instead of making it from scratch. And I have a really, really good brown butter carrot cake recipe that is really intensive, but it's amazing. It's like the best carrot cake I've ever had in my life. And then I thought about it and I was like, it's okay to make an accommodation for myself, to accept help, to buy the cake at the grocery store because I didn't have the time or the space to make the really time-intensive version. It still brought me the same connection to my family, to my joy, as a homemade cake would. So in the story, Tantie Merle, she accepts this accommodation from her child. You know, could she take care of the goat herself? Absolutely. I mean, it's hard for her and it was becoming really difficult, but because she valued her family and her connection, she accepted the accommodation. And I accept the accommodation of store-bought cake, I guess, is what I'm saying. So thanks for sticking with me on this one. Next week, I would love to have you back, and we should by next week. I cannot announce to you what story we will be talking about because my hope is that this Sunday we will hear about the Nebula nominations for 2026, which are stories from 2025. And I will be picking one of those and doing a tight turnaround on the podcast with a fun new snack and hopefully a newly nominated story. However, I can tell you that the week after we will be talking about a full-length novel. So if you want to get a jump on that, go ahead and get yourself a copy of Emily Tesch's award-winning novel, Some Desperate Glory. This was one of my favorite books that I read in the past year or so, and Emily Tesch has since become an auto-buy author for me. So I cannot wait to talk about that book in 2 weeks with you. Thank you so much for hanging out with me again this week. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.